All right, folks, welcome back. This week we're going to continue our talk about color. This is, to me, one of the most interesting aspects of graphic design, just because there's a whole world going on kind of under the radar that people don't pay attention to, that graphic designers are very aware of how color affects people and how it can kind of send them in one direction or another almost subconsciously. And that just to me is very interesting. So we're gonna go a little further this week. I haven't had a chance to grade your assignments from last week yet, but I will today, and I will post some examples so you can look at each other's work. That seems to be working pretty well. The second part of Chapter 2 talks about coding with color, kind of color systems, and then it talks about the psychology of color. And to me, the psychology of color, that's really cool, really interesting stuff. And we're going to have an assignment dealing with that too. So, first of all, on page 104, it talks about coding with color. And whenever you are designing for a brand or for a company, things like that, especially if you're doing logo design, one of the first things you do when you're doing branding is you come up with a color palette, a color system for this company. And it mentions on, let's see, where does it? On page 106, it talks about an identity manual, and there's a little illustration there. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but an identity manual is something that big companies have that kind of helps distinguish their brand. It keeps it uniform, and so whenever people are designing for this brand, there are rules that they can follow so that all their business collateral is recognizable as that brand. For example, you might have one or two main colors in a logo for a company, and then there will be, and that's the kind of the primary color palette is 2 to 3 colors, and then you might have a secondary color palette that are all colors that kind of go with that color, either in saturation or intensity or value, whatever that may be, and then you might even have a tertiary palette. That's like the the third level down. So this can looking on page 106, that's pretty in-depth palette. And I worked for U.S. Bank for a while doing some of their marketing, and they had their book, their identity manual was probably about this thick, and it had rules for everything: how big the logo could be, how small it could be, where it was placed on the page, how much white space around it. Then it had a whole color palette thing where you can use these colors next to each other, can't use these colors next to each other, and it just a whole lot of stuff. And the logo could only be on top of certain colors, not on top of others. So there's really in depth, and you really kind of need to understand that as you go forward as a designer. But this also this is very useful. These kind of color systems, because you can kind of start to group things. Like there's a picture of some brochures on 105. That are all kind of in the same color family. Like you can have, maybe different shades of the same color. A light blue, a darker blue. That's kind of the very basic way to do it. You could also have colors that are the same saturation. Like maybe you have a real kind of a faded light blue and a faded light orange and faded light green. And so all these kind of go together and form this sort of color family. And there's a really good example of that on 104 and 105. These bottles down here, if you look at that in your book, this is kind of a brand family. It's all these different products that they have, and they make them recognizable together because they all have an icon kind of on the bottom right, but then they all use this same sort of desaturated color scheme, like kind of a lightish green, a lightish brown, a lightish blue. The red is actually, just looking at it, to me the red kind of stands out. Doesn't really seem like it fits because it's a little brighter than the rest. But they probably did that because they didn't want to, they wanted to stay out of the pink range because pink has its own colors associated with it, or its own feelings associated with it. So that's very useful as a designer, and it also helps to separate information. For instance, color coding, you might have, the most basic example of this is, you get a big binder and they have color tabs so you can see the different sections. But that's used in books and manuals and all over the place just to kind of help people categorize information into certain areas. So, and there's at the bottom of 107, last week I asked you to kind of to find an ad that had an analogous color scheme. Those three colors that are kind of next to each other on the color wheel. And these packages at the bottom of 107 for Corez, whatever it is, are kind of examples, especially the first two, the orange and the red, are examples of using this analogous color scheme to kind of create unity. That's just a real easy way, if you don't know what color you want it to be, or you don't know how you want to lay something out, that's a good strategy to use, one strategy. So, it talks about color proportioning. I'm not going to get into that too much. It's a little abstract, in my opinion. Limited color systems, like I said, you want to use, if you're trying to keep something recognizable as a certain brand or a certain object, you really want to use kind of the same family of colors consistently throughout, so it is recognizable. And there's talks about some printing issues on 108 and 109. We're not going to get into that too much because that's more production side, not so much conceptual design side, and that's what I want to focus on. But be familiar with these terms, like a monotone image and a duotone. That's just where they use one ink instead of 4 inks, and you get kind of a, you use the ink like more saturated ink to get shadows and not much ink at all to get highlights. Like the blue. I don't know if you can see that. That kind of like that. That's the monotone image. And being aware of these, once you start to use Photoshop and things like that, you'll understand how you can get these effects. But you can really affect how a photo looks by taking these things into effect. For instance, if you put kind of a yellowish hue over an image, it might look kind of old-fashioned or old-timey. Because that's those old photos. That's they had a yellowish hue. They had a yellowish hue to them because that's just the way the photography was with the paper and the way they captured photographs back then. You can also get some interesting effects by taking blocks of color and reducing the opacity of them, so it's kind of see-through, and then you can see parts of the photo, but it gives the sort of a tint to it. So some really interesting ways you can play around with that. And for instance, if you put like a blue cast over a photo, it's going to give it this kind of cold, almost dead feeling to it. And there's a really good example of this on 113. There's two of the same photos. One has kind of a greenish cast to it, and one has kind of a bluish cast. You can kind of see how that can lend itself to different feelings. Color psychology, to me, is one of the most interesting things about graphic design. And basically what it is, there's a small example on page 110 and 111 about how people perceive colors. And, just like a lot of other things we've been talking about, this is very subjective based on a person's, past experiences, culture, what socioeconomic background they have, all these things. But there are certain underlying rules that are pretty standard. And if you read about these, it gives you a very limited description of what colors do to a person, how a person perceives these colors. Excuse me. For instance, red is the most vibrant color. It's out of all the colors, red is the one that is the most noticeable. Your eye, if you have a page with black, green, yellow, and red, your eye is going to go to the red first. That's just kind of the way your brain processes things. That's why red is used for stop signs, fire trucks, ambulances, all these things, because it's the most noticeable color. And if you look online, there are a million pages that give you more in-depth examples. If you find this interesting, like I do, before I did this, I read for about an hour on some of the different things that color can signify. I just think it's very interesting. And so you can find a lot more in-depth stuff online. I highly suggest you do that if you're interested. Blue is a very calming color. And I'll let you read through all these. I wrote down a few things that I thought that it doesn't really talk about in the book, just interesting things about colors. For instance, white. In our culture, white is very pure, clean, kind of symbolism. In other cultures, for instance, in Hindus, white is associated with death. And I think it's because they wrap their dead in white sheets. So it's where black would be associated with death in our culture.